Yes.
Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting in a few minutes. Welcome, everyone, to UCSC's Early Days, the creation of an uncommon campus. I'm George Craw. It's my pleasure today to introduce our two speakers, Frank Zwart and Bill Domhoff. Frank Zwart arrived at the University of California, Santa Cruz in 1967 when the campus was a mere 2 years old and the students were walking across planks where pipes were still open. He graduated in mathematics in 1971. 2 years later, Frank boarded a train east to study architecture at Princeton University, receiving his master in architecture degree in 1976. Frank then worked with architectural firms in Princeton, Los Angeles, Santa Monica, Aptos, California, Philadelphia, and Carmel before returning to UC Santa Cruz in 1985 as staff architect. Frank became the campus architect in 1988 and directed UCSC's Office of Physical Planning and Coordination, PPC, until retirement in April of 2010. His long and distinguished career at UCSC spanned 10 years of 7 chancellors. Frank was elevated to the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects in 2010. And I have to mention that I've known Frank for 50 years. We were RAs together at Beard House. It's just, it's just wonderful to have him here today talking about the campus history. Bill Domhoff G. William Domhoff is his formal name, but he goes by Bill, and he's a distinguished professor emeritus and research professor in psychology and sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He says he was born into an apolitical American family that he and his friends thought of as Midwest. He graduated from Rock River High School in Cleveland in 1954, received his BA at Duke in 1958, his MA at Kent State in 1959, and his PhD at the University of Miami in 1962. After 3 years as an assistant professor at Cal State LA, he has been at the UC Santa Cruz since 1965. He retired on July 1st, 1994, on a golden handshake, and finally stopped teaching during the 2018-2019 academic year. For those who may remember him in terms of power structure research, visit his website, which we'll have on later. And for those who took his dreams class, he has another website for that, which is also in the bio that you got in the registration materials. I also say that his book, Who Rules America, I thought of when I was a student as the most useful book I read on campus. And then a couple decades later, when I got a job in Washington, I reread the later version and thought, yeah, this was the most useful book I had at Santa Cruz. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Frank and Bill.
Thanks, George. Let me get my screen sharing here if I can find the right place. I think that's it. And let me go to the beginning. And let me also comment what a delight it is to join Bill in this presentation. I think the last time we shared a stage together, he and I were blue marbles in a human Chinese checkers game in the Cowell College courtyard as part of one of our college culture breaks. I'm starting here. with a couple of photographs of UCSC site. In the upper one, you can see the grading starting for the East Field and the East Field House, and below, this is from a slide in Physical Planning Constructions collection with a bunch of early Cowell College design drawings. So I've always assumed that's the site of Cowell College before there was a Cowell College. But given that I'm starting with these photographs of land, I thought it would be appropriate to begin in a way that's now become customary for UC Santa Cruz presentations and discussions with a land acknowledgement. UCSC is located on the unceded territory of the Wawa-speaking Yupi tribe, the Ama Mutsun tribal band composed of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonialization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. The web link below, which will be dropped into the comments box, will tell you much more about that. They're working very closely with the Arboretum on issues of land preservation, restoration. What am I going to talk about? Well, it's hard to talk about the founding of UC Santa Cruz without talking about the time in which it was created. And I think it's hard to say now, to overestimate now, the optimism of California and the amount of attention that the rest of the nation was pointing to us here on the left coast. I'm going to talk about the long process by which Santa Cruz was chosen to host a University of California campus. That's a particularly interesting story. I'm going to talk about some of the thought that went into what the residential college was intended to do. This, a paper by politics professor Carl Lamb that really dug into that in some depth. Of course, I'll talk about the 1963 long-range development plan and some of the early architecture, particularly that of Cowell College. This, the land use map from that first long-range development plan. And I'm going to talk about the university's face to the world. This is Dean McHenry in a pretty much full-page photograph from an article in the Saturday Evening Post in 1964, mostly about the entire University of California, but with a mention or two of Santa Cruz. Along the way, I'm going to intersperse it with a few surprises, little known facts or events that surprised me as I have spent my time doing this research, and then some of the hidden jewels that I've uncovered along the way, mostly drawings and images of things that might have been, but in most cases, fortunately, aren't. I want to also mention the resources I've used. When I retired in 2010, I started doing some research into the history of the campus that culminated in a show. I worked with Emeriti professors Jim Clifford, Michael Cowan, and Virginia Jansen on an organization that coincided with the campus's 50th anniversary in 2015. The digital wizards at University Library have put it online, and you can see it there. Then I also wrote a book about the story of, I wrote an article for a publication of the local Art and History Museum about the attraction, the work that brought University of California to Santa Cruz. That's available for the Art and History Museum's website. And finally, Bill Doyle, who I'm very sad to say, founding biology faculty. We just got email yesterday that he passed away earlier this week. Bill wrote a book and published it on lulu.com about the origin of UC Santa Cruz. Bill is a graduate, or was a graduate, of Watsonville High School, so he was particularly interested in the work that it came. But Bill, when we talk about founding fathers, Bill was a founding faculty member of Cowell College, a founding faculty member of Oaks College, and also helped to found what became the Marine Lab and Ocean Sciences Center. So the campus has really lost one of its earlier creators. Archival collections, both at the University Library here in Santa Cruz and at Berkeley, have been especially important. And the oral histories, the Berkeley and Santa Cruz are the two UC campuses with oral history projects, almost all of which I think you can now download, and they allow fascinating reading, not just about planning and architecture issues, but about the growth of California. So here we go. When I would do a version of this presentation or would talk about the creation of Santa Cruz to younger audiences, I would say that it's difficult to capture or recapture the optimism of those days. And I would mention a magazine, Look magazine, that had an entire issue devoted to the Golden State. We were about to overtake New York as the most populous state. Everything was possible here. Years later, I think it was even after I retired, my brothers and I were cleaning out the house that I lived with, that we grew up in Pasadena after my parents had died. And my brother found a stack of newspapers with interesting headlines, notable headlines. And in it was that very Look magazine. I had no idea that my father had saved it. Also in it, in that stack, was the Life magazine that you saw at the beginning of the presentation, and a Newsweek magazine from 1962 talking about the #1 state, California. And it's interesting to see how they talked about us. You can see all of the vehicles driving into California. Things were booming here. And they talked about the various regions of California, including the Bay Area, which they described as being around the jewel of San Francisco with research labs and electronic plants, luxurious suburbs, thinking of San Mateo County, and universities, Cal and Stanford. And this part I loved. Its ferment of saxophones, cyclotrons, and egghead beaten intellectuality, and the older fermentings of Santa Clara and Napa Valley vineyards. That's how the rest of the country saw this part of the world. But more seriously, it did talk about the challenges that California faced. The fact that so much of the state budget went into the public school system and to the University of California, then described as tuition free, and about the expansion plan. And clearly Santa Cruz was part of that. It goes on to talk about things we've heard about in the subsequent 50-some years, the swelling tax burden, and the concern about driving industry away or discouraging new businesses. And this was at the time when Richard Nixon was running for governor against the first Governor Brown. Nixon, as he would always do, saw signs of tax resistance among businessmen in California, but incumbent Pratt Brown was leaning to master plans made in Sacramento. There's a remarkable recording of him speaking at the site dedication for UC Santa Cruz in 1964, in which he talks about the need to invest in the growth of the university. And he says something along the lines to the audience of, "You call them taxes, I call them investment." On a more personal note, let's see, we lost the quote from Todd Newberry. From the oral history, from one of those oral histories, Todd Newberry, who'd been an undergraduate at Princeton and a graduate student at Stanford, and then done research at Hopkins Marine Station across the bay in Pacific Grove, talked about what brought him to Santa Cruz. And he talked about the University of California being maybe the only public institution in the country that it had the confidence or the will or the power to transform undergraduate education. If it was going to happen anywhere, it was going to be here in California. And that really, I think, summarizes the spirit of those days. It was the baby boom, as the California historian Kevin Starr pointed out. By 1960, members of the baby boom would be starting college, and the state had actually done a lot of planning for that. In the mid-1940s, they had created a body to coordinate planning for education throughout the state. In the mid-50s, they did a couple of studies that quantified what was going to be needed in the way of colleges and universities. The 1956 study looked at where they might go, including what was called the South Central Coast. And in 1959, the master plan for higher education was published, and it established the tripartite system of higher education, under which all high school graduates in the state would be eligible for admission into a community college, the top 25% of graduates into what was then the California State College system, and the top 1/8 or 12.5% into the University of California. It also reserved to the University of California the authority to issue doctorates and to manage professional schools. And this will have an important part of our story a little bit later on. Santa Cruz, by contrast, was something of a backwater. Statewide population was increasing about 50% throughout the state, but Santa Cruz was only growing 10%. It had the highest proportion of population aged over 65 of any city in the state, and the median income, educational level, and percentage of college graduates were clearly below standard. And one thing that really surprised me was that in the 1950s, there were no education possibilities behind high school. A high school graduate then from Santa Cruz County, in order to get a college education, would have to leave. But it was working to remedy that. In the 58, a junior college district was established, and in 1960, there was a 75% approval of bond issue. That meant taxes to fund initial construction of what was to become Cabrillo College. Local governments were doing the sorts of things that progressive governments throughout the country were doing, a capital improvement program, a countywide general plan that they worked on in 1959 and 1960. And it's worth a quick look at that. The land use map from that document actually identifies a place for the University of California. And the university was seen as a real economic engine. That plan said locating a university branch campus in Santa Cruz could accelerate the growth of the northern part of the county to such an extent that all forecasts of population and economic growth could be reached 10 years earlier than projected. So attracting a University of California campus here was seen as both a remedy to their educational woes and as an economic driver. On a broader context, this was the time of the space race. You probably remember all of the woes about the inadequacies of our educational system, shown here in a group of editorial cartoons from across the country that the New York Times published in 1958, after the former Soviet Union launched the first Sputnik in October of 1957. Just 2 weeks later, and I don't think it's a coincidence, the Regents met and appointed Clark Kerr as the chancellor at Berkeley. He was the chancellor to oversee, he was the chancellor at Berkeley. He was appointed president of the entire university, and he was the one to oversee the remarkable expansion of the state. One of the things he did, I think, that was entirely consequential was to decentralize the authority of the university. So he sent out a letter giving to chancellors and to campuses much more autonomy than they'd had in the past. And the result, I think, is a university system in which each campus has been allowed to develop its own direction and its own personality. And I think that's one of the great strengths of the university system. Even more important, at that same meeting, the Regents approved the start of site selection and planning for 3 new campuses. Now, the city was monitoring this very closely, the city and county. And just a month later, a committee that the Greater Santa Cruz Chamber of Commerce had put together invited representatives of the university's Office of the President down to show them 4 different sites in Santa Cruz. It was chaired by Gordon Scotchy Sinclair, who was the editor of the Sentinel, a really interesting character. His family wasn't able to afford to send him to college because his father had died when he was young. So when he graduated from high school, he went to work at the Sentinel and worked his way up through the ranks and worked there until he died in 1983. I think it said that he worked until 2 days before his death. He was a passionate advocate of higher education. He corresponded with public office holders and public figures throughout California and across the United States. And as you'll see as we go through this, the Sentinel was a real tool in attracting the university here. The other person, I don't think he was on the committee, but was very important in the development of the campus, was Hal Hyde. Hal just passed away last October. He was a native of Watsonville. His family owned and managed Ford's department store. He actually grew up in Berkeley. His father had died and his mother moved the family to Berkeley when he was young. He went to Cal, was in the Army during World War II, then went to business school at Harvard and came back to Santa Cruz, to Watsonville, to manage his family's business. And he was very active. He was the campus's first business vice chancellor. He was instrumental in starting Cabrillo College. He was really one of the classic civic-minded citizens of Santa Cruz County and of UC Santa Cruz. So in November, they visited 4 potential sites, 3 of which I've seen the names of, but don't know exactly where they are. And then, of course, what ultimately became the site of the campus, the Cowell Home Ranch in Santa Cruz. And here's how they tried to sell Santa Cruz. This is what they gave those officials from the Office of the President. Talking about Santa Cruz, one of the lowest crime rates in the state, a clean city, clean air and clean citizens, a city of churches of all denominations, and a city without racial prejudices. And because of its resort trade, it said it had plenty of housing for students during the school year. And because it handled thousands of tourists during the season, we had lots of freeways to provide for first-class auto travel. The optimism of the 1950s. The university, meanwhile, did what universities often do on big projects and put together a faculty committee chaired by a professor of oceanography at the Scripps Institute in San Diego. Admiral Wheelock had been involved in naval design during the war, and he chaired and actually became a member of the UC Santa Cruz Campus Planning Committee when he retired to Carmel. And it's an interesting document. It quantified the kinds of things they would be looking for in the new sites. Remember, they were looking for 3 sites in different parts of the state. And much of what was in it you would expect to see. The size of the new campuses, each of them was to be about 25,000 students. And that was projected to develop or lead to a university-connected community of 50 to 100,000 people. It said that it should go close to the populations, placed near the center of the population served. So that again becomes important in our story a little further down the line. And it also talked about the importance. It saw the difficulty, or it saw recruiting faculty and students as a real challenge, especially to a new institution. So it very much saw the community and the assets of a community as a tool in that recruitment. So that was one of the criteria that established. But here's our first surprise. In a document like this, I was really quite surprised to see that aesthetics was listed as a specific criteria in site selection. And it starts off its section by noting that California is endowed with many areas of great natural beauty, and therefore it was fitting that the best of them be preserved and developed to public use. So it seems appropriate that the state university develop its cultural centers on inspiring sites, maybe from natural plantings, vistas to mountains, ocean, stream, or lake, but whatever, it should have a strong character to unify and complement the physical development of the campus. Also in there was an acknowledgement of the role of the community and its living environment to attract faculty, students, and staff, and to support the development of the university. Ironically, to establish or to find a site on the South Central Coast, the Office of the President hired two Stanford grads, Larry Livingston, who went to get a law degree at Yale and a planning degree from MIT, and John Carl Warnecke, who then went on to study architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And they took a look at 74 sites shown in light blue in the map on the right, looked at the darker blue sites at 15 of them, and wound up looking in great detail at 4 of the sites, 3 of them in the Santa Clara Valley, and the 4th site, the Cowell Ranch here in Santa Cruz. The city was aware that this was going on, and Gordon Sinclair, the editor of the Sentinel, who I mentioned earlier, sent a note out to various organizations urging them to send letters to him and to the committee, to the University of California Site Committee, that would then be passed on at an appropriate time to the Office of the President, selling the advantages of Santa Cruz. And many of these are in the UCSC library and in Gordon Sinclair's archives at McHenry Library. And just a few of them, you would expect to see the YWCA, the Women's Club of Santa Cruz, the Congregational Church, which pointed out an interesting connection, saying that one of its early pastors had actually been one of the founders of the University of California. It also offered their meeting room as a place for meetings as the planning went on. And in fact, as you'll see a little later on, the Regents' approval of the long-range development plan occurred in that meeting room. But 2 of my favorite, this pointing out the aging population of Santa Cruz was the National Association of Retired Civil Employees and Santa Cruz, or the State Federation of Opera Poets. Everybody got into the game of trying to attract the university. Sinclair had developed correspondence relationships with people throughout the state and sent letters personally to state senators, to the assembly member, to the superintendent of public education, to the governor, to various regents. And in fact, the notes show a lunch at the Pacific Union Club in April of 1958. Sam Lease was the son of the family that ran Lease Department Store in Santa Cruz, in downtown Santa Cruz. He had gone on to become the first city administrative officer in Los Angeles. Sinclair and the city manager had lunch at the Union Club with the chair of the board of the chairman of the board of the Bank of America, the publisher and managing editor of the San Francisco Examiner, and the vice president of Pacific Telephone and Telegraph. So they were trying to line up the movers and shakers into their effort to get a campus. Back to Warnke and Livingston's study, they narrowed it down to two final sites, the Almaden Valley site and the Cowell Ranch site. And their final report to the Regents said, if it were decided to establish a campus that would grow slowly in a situation where a university-oriented community could readily develop around it, Cowell Ranch would offer the greatest promise of attaining those goals. But if attracting a large enrollment in a relatively short time and relief of the Berkeley campus are more important considerations, a Santa Clara Valley site should be chosen. In February of 1959, that report went to the Regents, and in December, they recommended further studies of Almaden. And now begins what Hal Hyde in his oral history called the unselling of Almaden. The committee sent letters to the Regents and state officials reopening their pleas to come to Santa Cruz. They started a national publicity campaign trying to get articles in magazines, to get feature coverage of the Santa Cruz area. And then there's the legendary bus trip, which is clearly a part of the creation myth of UC Santa Cruz. Setting out from Berkeley, a group of people from the Office of the President and most of the Board of Regents. This was a day before the Regents were to meet here in Santa Cruz in July of 1960. They took a bus down to the Cowell Ranch site where they were greeted by the planning committee and taken on a very well choreographed tour of the campus. They bladed roads up through the undeveloped land so that the bus, an air-conditioned bus, could get up there. They saw the site. It was a beautiful, sparkling July morning. They saw the views. They got back on the bus, drove over the hill to Almaden, where they hit a hot day with smog in the distance. The bus was too big to navigate the site of Almaden. They got into smaller, unair-conditioned buses and drove around. And I want to stop that story for a moment and call your attention to a drawing in the second photograph on the Sentinel, because that leads to another of our hidden jewels. This sales pitch for the city of Santa Cruz draws a potential campus on the university, and it really looks like, I'm assuming this is a gymnasium. These are standard academic buildings, all on the lower meadows of the Cowell Ranch. Very much looks like UC Riverside on the Cowell Ranch. And inside is page after page of the benefits of Santa Cruz, the wonderful weather that we have. They took a look at the criteria that the faculty committee had put together and addressed every single one of them. And in conclusion, describing itself as a city on the march, a clean, livable city lending itself to university life, free from crime and congestion. No rivers of smog to irritate the eyes, nor valleys of vice to destroy the temperance of conduct. Tranquil yet progressive surroundings. It is the type of community that is attractive to faculty and students alike, free from disturbing factors and small enough today that the university can exert a strong influence in molding the community's future. So their strategy was to play up the beauty of the site and the willingness of the community to grow with the university and to downplay its distance from the population centers of the East Bay and Santa Clara Valley. Dean McHenry's oral history says that he overheard Regent Dorothy Chandler say on the way back why it had cost us a fortune to air condition a campus there in the Almaden Valley site in comparison to the Santa Cruz site. So I think they had done their job very well, because the next day at the Regents meeting, they reopened the possibility of a Cowell Ranch site, and they agreed to allow further study of both Almaden and the Cowell Ranch. And the next meeting in September, they agreed to share the cost of that planning for the Santa Cruz site. At the same time, President Kerr had appointed a distinguished faculty committee. William Wurster, who was the founding dean of Berkeley's College of Environmental Design, psychology professor Clarence Brown, and philosophy professor Stephen Pepper were asked to visit both sites, and their recommendation to Kerr was unanimous for the Cowell Ranch over the Almaden Valley because of the natural beauty of the site, the spectacular character of the Cowell Ranch, and the regards to natural beauty, cost, and community setting. I think there had been some quiet conversations between the Cowell Foundation and the Office of the President that the sales price for the land would then be donated back to the campus for what would become Cowell College. And all of that really swung things back towards Santa Cruz. The campus put together, the city and county put together a planning team. Campbell and Wong, the architects, went on to design Merrill College. Bob Royston, the landscape architect, designed one of the great pieces of landscape architecture anywhere in the world, the Upper Quarry Amphitheater. And this is the vision they put together for a new UC Santa Cruz. Again, built in the meadows with the sorts of things that were very common to college campuses in those days. You can see a model photograph on the left, an administration building, a library, a student union, but a few things that 50 years on are very foreign to our ears. Fraternities, sororities, and high density residential areas just to the south of the campus, a school of home economics, and a building for physical education and military science. They also showed how this would fit into the community. The central campus and the high density residential area would be linked by a commercial area on campus land with areas for varsity athletics and community recreation over in the Pogonip, and up off of Empire Grade, a site for a university golf course. In December of 1960, that plan was presented to the Regents meeting in Santa Barbara. The Cowell Ranch got unanimous preference over the Almaden site. There were 3 months of negotiation under which the Cowell Foundation formally offered the sale of the land to the Regents. And in March of 1961, at a Regents meeting in Berkeley, the Regents voted 16-2 in favor of Santa Cruz. The only two dissenting vote were the two politicians, I think, thinking of all the votes in Santa Clara Valley. Now, it is said that Edmund Brown used to claim that he put the 3 new University of California campus sites in the 3 counties that voted against him in the 1962 gubernatorial election against Nixon, San Diego, Orange, and Santa Cruz. But if he'd had his way, we would have been in Santa Clara Valley and not here in Santa Cruz. The Sentinel rejoiced, cities rejoice over the selection, and this was full front page news in Santa Cruz just after the Regents made that decision. Planning the new campus, then the focus goes back to the Office of the President. Bob Evans, the first of these people, this is a photograph I took of him a month after his 98th birthday. He had served as the university architect from the mid 40s until 1972. He was, and I think he'd worked for the university since the 1930s in an architectural capacity. A wonderful, wonderful guy, very much, and you'll see some of his contributions as we go along. He nominated Jack Wagstaff. Jack had been the campus architect at UC San Francisco. What Bob Evans told me was they didn't know who was going to be chancellor at Santa Cruz. Jack Wagstaff had shown he could get along with the doctors. And if he could get along with the doctors, he could get along with anyone. So I'm very proud of the fact that the campus architect at UC Santa Cruz was its very first employee. And then in July, McHenry was appointed by the Regents as the first chancellor. And the story, longstanding story of the friendship between Kerr and McHenry had met as graduate students at Stanford. Kerr would always argue the benefits of a small college. He'd gone to Swarthmore. McHenry was a UCLA graduate, and he argued the colleges of a big college. And their idea of building a new campus of residential colleges that would seem small while growing large is another important part of the Santa Cruz Foundation story. This is a document I came across in the archives, I think, of Wurster, Bernardi, and Emmons. Just after that decision was made, there was going to be a meeting with Clark Kerr on the new campus plans. And a man named Elmo Morgan, who was the vice president in charge of physical development. Morgan had an interesting history as well. He'd been involved in developing the Los Alamos nuclear test site during World War II. And I think there's a whole story to be told about that. And he oversaw the development of the 3 new campuses. He was Bob Evans' boss. And he asked Bob Evans to put together some thoughts on a new campus. So this is out of Bob Evans's typewriter. What the University of the Future would be is what he talked about, and he used Santa Cruz as an example. This is a theme that comes up over and over again in planning for the colleges in the 50s and 60s. The pressure for mass education with limitations on funding are going to bring about new concepts and techniques of education. Techniques born of modern developments such as teaching machines, automation, data processing equipment, and television should be used to develop a new campus, to take advantages of those modern mechanisms and offset the mechanism with the reduction in scale and development of residential colleges. In other words, use technology to reduce the scale of the living experience for students on the campuses. And arts and sciences colleges for lower and upper division with supporting residence halls with single rooms equipped with educational television and teaching machines. It only took some 50 years for the internet to actually accomplish that. Central Library need no longer be at the heart of the campus, as it is now an intelligence center, issuing microfilm via pneumatic tubes or televising tapes, etc. Again, the internet. Perhaps all of the colleges disposed around a new center of the Student Union, the Museum and Fine Arts Gallery, the theater and auditorium, sort of a downtown for the collection of campus villages. Again, sort of seeing what a new campus might be. And this is another surprise, was the idea or conveying a vision of technology as a way to decentralize. This is the Fine Arts and Communications building that opened in 1968, a couple of hidden, and I remember going up there to photograph Page Smith talking to a television camera for his colonial history class. I also remember sitting in language labs listening to French tapes, but I don't remember this being a central part of our education. Along with that, two drawings of things that never got built were to be a television platform and viewing area in the woods just outside the communications building, a real reliance on that. What happened? There's a clue to that, I think, in a paper that was given by an academic planner in 1971, conference in Chicago, talking about instructional media being very present in Santa Cruz, but not really accepted. There's an overwhelming concern for humanizing the undergraduate's education and a fear that technology will undermine the goal. And I think that very much accords with my recollection of our time at Santa Cruz. And now the team that put this together, Jack Wagstaff, you've already met. Dean McHenry was appointed the first chancellor. September and December of '61, architects were interviewed, and a master planning team of architects, John Carl Warnke, Ernest Kump, Theodore Bernardi, Bob Anchin and Stephen Allen, and landscape architect Thomas Church were put together to do the plan. All Bay Area architects and landscape architects. And it made its first visit to the campus in early March. That's where the photograph is taken. That same issue of the Sentinel has the iconic photograph of McHenry sitting at an empty desk in the great meadow overlooking downtown. Bring on the students, said McHenry. Tommy Church gets a special mention because he wrote some thoughts on developing the campus, and he had an enormous impact both on the master plan and early development of the campus. The general effect must be one of sensitive collaboration between the designer and this environment, magnificent in conception, daring and forthright in its architecture, but gentle be the hand it lays upon the land. The site was going to determine much of what happened here. Back to the architecture group as a whole and the plans that you saw a moment ago. These were actually based on a sketch that Bob Evans had done, showing relationships among an ideal campus on an ideal site. Anchin and Allen, the architects on the master plan, started to develop that, but you'll notice here a ring of residential colleges. This is reflecting an earlier sketch by Dean McHenry. But Tommy Church got them to look at the land. This is the 6 or 7 marine terraces, and they were identifying the land, and this is what was going to shape the campus. And Derek Parker, one of the architects who worked on this with Anchin and Allen, told me that they would get together weekly and brainstorm, and at one of those meetings, Church asked the assembled architects what really struck them about the site, what was its most prominent characteristic. And they all mentioned those spectacular views out over the meadows and the bay. And Church said, then why would we fill the meadow up with buildings? And the idea to build first then in the center of the campus rather than the meadows came up and was pushed forward. And there was a meeting set up in June of '62 to brief Kerr and Regent McLaughlin, chair of the Grounds and Buildings Committee, about that idea. And in a way, all hell broke loose at that meeting, bureaucratic hell. McHenry wrote a letter to Wagstaff summarizing that meeting. One thing that's interesting about it, I had always heard that a provision of the Cowell gift to Cowell College was that it be placed somewhere where it could see the city and the city could see it. And McHenry actually validated that or verified that in this letter, saying one or more of the Cowell trustees feels strongly the first residential college should be visible from the city. But the real surprise was that Kerr and McHenry didn't always agree. The academic plan, in discussing that, he really apologizes for the dialogue, showing how argumentative men with similar goals can be. A month later, Kerr wrote back to McHenry, "If you were surprised by my comments, you can imagine how surprised I was to see the plan. We had talked about a series of colleges like Caltech, Swarthmore, Williams, Reed, Carleton, Pomona, each with its own individuality. We'd also talked about Oxford and Cambridge. The emphasis was to be on close faculty-student relationships within a face-to-face group, on undergraduate, initially on teaching. I was enthusiastic. What I saw as the most prominent feature of the plan was a huge parking lot that looked like a couple hundred acres. Next, I saw large areas for intramural sports and intercollegiate sports. I saw a central core of the campus with halls for humanities, social sciences, and libraries, an area for fraternities and sororities. This looked more like a Berkeley or Los Angeles in the Redwoods than like Oxford or Cambridge or the Claremont colleges." McHenry wrote back to Kerr, and this was one of the real surprises, pointing at Claremont. "Maybe it's our nearest model in the USA, but I'm inclined to think Oxford and Cambridge are worthy of equal attention. Graduate work hadn't done much at Claremont after 3 decades. Little distinction. Neither has the research or creative work outstanding. They have done a good job with undergraduates that can be imitated, but they hadn't done much for research. We'll have to turn to great universities, including our own, for the formula of excellence in research graduate work." Kerr is shifting the center of gravity so much toward undergraduates. McHenry was worried that they'd be unable to attract faculty capable of doing the kind of research the university did. And it's not surprising that McHenry had this point of view. He was the university's representative on the committee that created the master plan that fought hard to get research as a center of the University of California activities. This also became a challenge for the architects. There were several memos in the files sort of summarizing the different points of view between Kerr and McHenry on the various parts of things, trying to understand how that was to shape the campus. Kerr was seen as favoring a dispersed scheme. McHenry was seen as favoring a centralized scheme. The residential college actually had a long history in American higher education, going back to Claremont in 25. Berkeley had actually worked on a report in the mid-50s trying to revamp undergraduate education that really hadn't gone very well. The famous saying about the seam small as it grows large, I saw in the campus's first academic plan. But even before that, Kerr had sent McHenry to the University of Pacific to talk to the president of the University of Pacific there. And in his letter back to Kerr, he describes what UOP's president was trying to do was to try to grow larger by becoming smaller. And that became a driving force behind the Santa Cruz model. McHenry brought an English professor from Williams College and Carl Lamb, a political science professor with a background as a Rhodes Scholar at Brasenose College in Oxford, to advise one summer on the residential college. And Carl Lamb put together a long paper talking about the residential college and how it might work here. He spent a lot of time talking about the history of the British model. He talked about it being expanded throughout British higher education, seeing that they were going to be attracting students who didn't have a tradition of culture, and they saw this as a way of enriching undergraduate lives by a period of residence on a campus in a residential college. Hopefully, the residential college situation encourages the dialogue between generations that a university makes possible. He talks about the Yale colleges and the Harvard houses and recent American efforts, particularly at Michigan State University. And in talking about the Santa Cruz campus, he talks about we have nothing to worry about. We don't need to tear anything down. We can start from scratch. But in his discussion of Yale and Harvard, he points out the tendency of the academic departments to really attract and hold the power in academic institutions. This then these works became a summary presented to the Regents in July of '62. They happily approved the move of the center of the campus to the core. And I love this photograph of the Regents in convertibles driving down the Great Meadow after that meeting. And this is when the Regents approved the final LRDP. Now you can see the organization is a campus core surrounded by lots of colleges. And this led to a commonly held belief that Santa Cruz was developed in response to student protest at Berkeley. That's actually not the case. I mean, lots of people, including Rebecca Solnit, a very astute Bay Area writer and critic, really mentioned it in an article in the Guardian a few years ago about being infamous, Santa Cruz being infamous as being designed to lure away student radicals and sequestering them in beautiful isolated campus. But the fact is that the free speech movement occurred in the fall of 1964, and by that time Santa Cruz was well underway. But it actually gets much more interesting than that, because the following month, just after the free speech movement, this article appeared in the Los Angeles Times, and it talks about the cozy campus created at Santa Cruz in some ways as a way of diffusing that kind of situation. They did a cost-benefit study, which the Regents were expected. There were concerns that Santa Cruz was going to cost too much, but McHenry said after the vote that the free speech troubles had contributed to the Regents' determination to push ahead at Santa Cruz. The "it will cost more" win syndrome seemed weaker. We are heartened by this increased concern for the undergraduate. I see Dean McHenry as having used the free speech movement as a sales point on the college system rather than being done in response to it. Also, and just before the Loma Prieta earthquake, I ran into Dean McHenry at a campus function, and my wife and I had just come back from a driving trip to the Pacific Northwest, and we had visited Simon Fraser University just outside of Vancouver. This is an aerial photograph. It's really a mega structure, very different in planning approach than Santa Cruz, but with similar academic goals. And I mentioned that to him, and Dean McHenry said to me, "Well, you know, that's an exact contemporary of ours. They opened like we did in September of 1965. He paused for a moment. He said, "But you know, I think they made a horrible mistake putting that big assembly space, that big plaza just outside the administration building." So Dean was very much aware of the potential for diffusing student protest on campus. In 1963, the LRDP was published. It called for 27,500 students. By 1991, it had a very elaborate road system, a loop system that could ultimately wind up in 4 or 6 lanes of traffic, an interior loop that could be 2 to 4 lanes in the long time. But if we look at the center of the campus, here are some hidden jewels. This is a big drawing we found when we did the 2015 exhibition. This is an early plan for Cowell College. This is McHenry Library. This is Science Hill, Tiemann Labs, or NatSci 1, NatSci 3, where we went for our civ lectures, so right about there. But 2 things pop out here at the Great Meadow. University House is right about here. Student Center is right about here. This was a possible design for an administration building that was never built at the head of this Great Meadow. Up there on Science Hill, years before this, somebody had come into my office with a roll of drawings and asked me if they'd ever seen these. And they unrolled these drawings that were 2.5 or 3 feet wide and 4 or 5 feet long, these incredible pastels that look like the Jetsons meet the Eiffel Tower. And I had no idea what they were, but I saw this little note here, and it said on it, Mark Roque Sketches. Before I came to work at the university, I had worked for an architect in Carmel named Olaf Dahlstrand, and Olaf had done some of the renderings for the long-range development plan. And he told me that there had been a young French architect working with that on him. So I called Olaf and I asked, was this French architect's name Mark Roque? And Olaf said, yes, it was. So I knew these had their heart in the long-range development plan. And in diving into the text of that document, I can see that it called for, on a dominating knoll up on Science Hill, would be a vertical architectural symbol, a great tower rising through the trees to provide orientation within the campus and identification from without. I think it's just as well that that was never built. The Regents approved the building in the master plan in 1963. That's in the Congregational Church. But they took a driving tour of the Cowell Ranch, and then they forwarded the LRDP to the full board. This is standard practice for recommendation for approval. But Dean Clark Kerr put in a little unhappy provision that explained why I was struggling with budgets for so long as I worked as campus architect. That was subject to the condition that state-funded capital and operating costs shall not exceed the costs on other campuses. And the next day it was approved by the full Board of Regents. But the other nice thing, this was part of a package of Regents items that were put together for that meeting, approving the sites of Cowell College and NatSci Unit 1, approving the designs of Cowell College and physical NatSci 1, although that didn't happen until a subsequent meeting. But at the top of this package was the following statement from Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer, one of the designers with Gilbert Vux of Central Park in New York, and really the founder of American Landscape Architecture. He actually for a while had managed a gold mine in the Sierras and was charged with visiting Yosemite Park and reporting on it to the state legislature. And he wrote about the importance of preserving and maintaining the natural scenery, making the scenery predominant in the development of the campus. It was really quite remarkable to see that this was the cover sheet for a series of documents that went to the Regents to remind them of the importance of respecting the site as the campus was developed. And lo and behold, a second happy surprise was that the Regents paid attention. The Sentinel the next day, preserve the beauty of the site, Regents tell architects. Chairman Hager of the board urged the architects to make every effort to preserve the beauty of the land and the land of what he termed the university's most exciting new campus. And here's what Cowell was thought to look like, an interesting sort of fun piece where these two drawings of what a lounge and a dorm room at Cowell were to look like. I remember spending plenty of time in rooms like that, although they were never furnished quite so nicely. And Theodore Bernardi, in being interviewed to work on the master plan, had done a really quite a wonderful, wonderful statement of purpose, describing his relationship to the great architect, the Berkeley architect, Bernard Maybach, the idea of capturing a spirit of time using the spirit of classical architecture without using its forms, using wood, stone, concrete, and steel. And he talks about Maybach as the originator of a style in this part of the world known as the Bay Area style, and associating himself with that. He also talked about the site, the beauty of the Santa Cruz site. And he talks about the southern slopes, the meadows, the old buildings that we see there. They suggest a mood that we may hope to capture in developing the environment of the new university. It may be possible that some of these structures can remain to remind us of the chain of development that I believe essential element of an orderly existence. Just a lovely, lovely thought about what a university does. And I think he incorporated that into his design of Cowell College's wonderful configuration of heavy timber and the red beams and the alternating black and green roof boards, one of the often unnoticed parts of Cowell College, but again, from that ranch building vernacular. Where else did he get his ideas? From Maybach. Now, an interesting point of view, Hal Hyde, who I mentioned earlier, told us that he'd been Bernard Maybach's paperboy when he was a kid in Berkeley. But this is Maybach's most famous building, probably the first Church of Christian Science in Berkeley. And you can see his use of industrial sash windows repeated here in those stairwells we know very well from the Cowell dorms. He also, this gallery at Cowell evokes the Arc, what was then the School of Architecture, is now the School of Berkeley of Journalism at Berkeley, with sort of an indoor-outdoor space, sharing this outdoor plaza space with an indoor gallery. And it's interesting, in notes from one of the meetings about, this is back and forth between Kerr and McHenry, on the back of this, I saw a handwritten note from Bernardi talking about why a center of the campus, why not many centers? For example, the Arc, engineering, art. And he talks about the Arc as a model for what might be accomplished at Santa Cruz. And I think I'm going to stop there. The rest of the thing, I've gone on longer than I had, but I think it's the heart of what's there for it. And I'm happy to now introduce Bill, and let me get myself back to Zoom. There we go. And suggest that Bill start his camera and unmute. You there, Bill?
I don't know.
Oh yeah, I hear you. Good.
It says start my video. Oh, start my video too. Okay.
All right, there you are.
Am I? Can't prove it by me. Oh, there I see me. Hello out there, alumni land.
So as a transition between our themes, Bill, I'm going to get things started. And George's introduction mentioned that you'd arrived here in July of 1965 as an assistant professor, having taught at LA State for 3 years. What brought you here? Did you notice that optimism and spirit of possibility among the faculty members who you joined, or with the faculty members who'd been here a little longer or came from the East, some of whom came in as associate and full professors?
Yeah, I sure did pretty quickly. You know, the dry thing is I came from Cal State LA, but that meant I came from that smog. And I lived in San Gabriel Valley. We moved in there, I think in the fall. And one day in the middle of the winter, it was a nice day. I looked out the front window and these mountains were right in my face. I had never seen the San Gabriel Mountains literally before. The smog was so great down there, especially out in that valley. At least people used to like to think that their area was less foggy than smoggy than others. Second thing, we were totally trapped in freeways. They were really prison ways. If things didn't go, you were late to class. So coming here in that sense was such a liberation. It was also, university was expanding that year, and that's why I had an opportunity to come here, but I also had an opportunity to maybe go to UC Davis. And that was a pretty different experience in terms of the heat, in terms of that huge stifling psych department. So coming here was kind of amazing because Page Smith did set a tone, and he'd hired people that were in some way atypical. And I mentioned the person who hired me, Bert Kaplan. He'd had all the great training. He was from Harvard. But he was thinking differently within psychology. And that's what he then fortunately liked about me, that I did the study of dreams. And Page Smith liked the fact that I was also studying about power. So it was so refreshing in that sense. And of course, everything about the place was just amazing. So, but I give that contrast to what it was like for a young professor who didn't know really many of the things you were saying about the background, but definitely they were out to overcome what they saw as stuffy ways. And given my interests, which were somewhat atypical, but I won't go into the background of how stifling psych was in those days. Yeah, it was a liberating experience, totally.
I spent a little time in the tug of war between Kerr and McHenry, which was really, I mean, the way the story came to me is that this was their creation, but Kerr, again, not surprisingly, giving his background at Swarthmore, was sort of a Claremont College's man, and McHenry was more a UCLA man. But I've heard you talk in the past about research and publishing standards, and you've talked about McHenry's Riverside speech. Could you get back to that and tell us all about it?
Yeah, it was funny because at first people did think in a very liberal arts way. But most of us been trained in a very specific way. In other words, we were experts on some small thing. And so it was going to be a retooling to become a liberal arts professor. And so as people were dealing with that in the spring of the first year I was there, McHenry had a meeting with all of the faculty, which was maybe 35, 40 of us at best. Some was all Cowell people plus a couple Stevenson people that were forerunners for the next year. And he told us about how at Riverside, these young people had all this enthusiasm for the campus. They'd done all this work to create it. But you know what? He said they didn't do any research and they didn't keep their jobs. And we all looked at each other, and I call it the parable of Riverside. And I used to joke that we all went back to our offices and shut our doors instead of having an open door policy, because it was clear that we were going to meet University of California standards on publication, which was not a surprise, or it was actually for me fine, because I was interested in my research and working with people that were interested in those things. And there were numerous students that were, and I was happy to see some of them that might be here today. But in any case, right there, the tone was set for a potential tension. And I think it did lead to a lot of our internal tensions, which were minor today, but some faculty members got deeply involved in the college. They didn't do much research. And then their, what was then called Board of Studies, would not want to keep them. And so there were some anguishing moments in every one of the colleges of young faculty who almost didn't get tenure or did not get tenure, but they were soon called, hey, they were pioneers, and they helped build the infrastructure of the college. And that was partly the way then that they received tenure and deserved it. But it created enormous attention, and several of us found ways to deal with it. Like some of the early students first year came to me and they said, hey, we want an introductory psychology course. And there wasn't one on the agenda. And that was for me almost frankly a liberating thing. And I said, well, if you go to Page Smith and he wants it, then I'll do it. I'll like to do it. So they went to Page Smith and he said, oh, sure, you got to have what you want to have. And so I'm suddenly teaching something I knew about. And I think that kind of spirit was part of it. And so all of a sudden, within frankly 3 or 4 years, there were virtually no faculty teaching in the core courses. Paige had a great secretary, and I think she maybe have a master's. She's the one that replaced me in the core course while I'm teaching psychology. So that kind of tension was really there. But that was at a lower level in the sense that was our experience, which is what I can talk about. I want to tell all the former psych students out there that psychology has moved so far, so fast, that when I go back and I read about developmental psychology, which is one of the things I taught, which the students called kiddie psych, I used to joke and say, sorry, when I meet alumni, everything I taught you was wrong. But really, I mean, it's out of date. but it is striking how when disciplines move forward, something gets accomplished. And in that sense, it was gratifying. But I don't believe a word I said back then.
Well, I want to pause our back and forth, our conversation, and remind people that if you have questions, we'd like to broaden our conversation to include everybody who's watching. So use the Q&A box to ask any questions of Bill or me, because we'd love to go back and forth with you and not just make it a dialogue between the two of us. I'm reminded, Bill, when in hearing the tug of war between over research or whatever within the university, for several years I had in my office something called the curmudgeon's calendar, which had sort of cranky statements for every day of the year. And one of my favorites, which I gave to Julia, to my wife, was from Frank Zappa. And it said, in the war between you and the world, back the world.
Yeah. I fought the law and the law won.
Exactly.
And that was true of what happened to our campus generally. There's just too many, like every 5 years, the department is reviewed outside. So in come these sociologists from all around, or these psychologists from all around, and then they make a report and say, well, your department is out of date, or you lack of this, or you lack a person in that, or, the future of psychology is X and you don't have one, so the higher levels take those reports seriously. So we had to scramble, and it just puts you in the situation of where you are definitely have to be thinking of the outside world. That was true incidentally of our tenure committees. So when I came up for tenure, there were definitely people from other campuses that helped decide that they were on this outside review committee. So in that sense, I was always, and I was always aware of it from an early time. Years later, I became chair of the Committee on Academic Personnel on our campus. And by then I knew the ropes pretty well. This was the mid 80s. And I tried to do some of the smallest changes that would reward teaching more. And if people were slowing down in their teaching, I said, look, I mean, in their research, we said, look, let them teach an extra course. And if they do it well, they had to do it well, let's give them a raise or two. And so the other people on the committee, one of them looked at me and said, Bill, you're going to lower the standards of the University of California. So here I was seeing as, you know, some sort of a bad guy and so I saw myself as just trying to loosen up the campus, be decent to people that were teaching well, and so I ended up in trouble. And I thought I could get away with it because, as people know, I'd written several books. So I thought I had the credentials. I could say we could be a little lighter on this. No. So that's the world you're talking about, Frank. I mean, I experienced it in very specific ways through colleagues, through outside colleagues, so on.
Well, you know, going back to the time when we were here between 67 and 71, we arrived in the fall of 67. At that point, you had 2 years under your belt of teaching and interacting with undergraduates at Cal. How would you evaluate Cal when we arrived? And do you remember much about our first year here, 67, 68?
Well, the thing was that the first year was chaotic here. We were off what's now one of the science buildings. We didn't have any other, and we had the library, and we had what's now the administration, the student building, and student administration stuff. And then, and that was all over the place. And then the next year we were just moving into Cal, and Stevenson was starting, and students were going to one of the two colleges. In a certain sense, by the time you arrived, we kind of had it down pat at the sort of Cowell College level. But what I remember is that was an incredibly chaotic year as far as outside forces, because what arrived to this campus from the outside, talk about the world winning, was the Vietnam War, the pressures of all kinds of movements that were going on. And so it changed everything. And some of you may have been listening, we're here in 67. I don't know whether Frosh would venture over, but they had an International Student Strike Day. And SDS asked me to speak, and I gave a talk, and McHenry was annoyed that there was going to be this, and he sent us a note, just a factual note that, you know, you can be, University of California faculty can be fired for being involved in a strike. And so I thought, what? I don't have a class that day. It's not my class. So I wrote I called the Regents, actually. I called their office, and I called the lawyer, and I said, look, if I speak to this student group, am I going to be fired? And they will get back to you. They said, no. But I mean, that was the kind of chaos we had at that point. So I gave a speech in the quarry. And so there was all kinds of that kind of disruption that was going on the campus. Somewhere in your time here, Ronald Reagan came to the campus. We organized, I think Crown probably existed by then, but yes, it did. So it was, I'm jumping to your second year, but we all marched from Stevenson, Cowell, and up to Crown, and students marched around the building. That was the kind of thing that I think your class experienced, was sort of one of these kind of amazing upheavals, or another nervy things like blockading the Regents meeting in the Crown dining hall. This was just going on a whole lot, or at least what we as a faculty then had to react to. And I was looking at some of my thoughts from back then, and I had started to hear a lot from students of ours that were going up to Berkeley, and they'd come back and tell me what was going on. And I started to say, this is crazy. The new left is going to be dead. They're going in the wrong direction. They got to stick on the path of strategic nonviolence. They got to do this, they got to do that. So I had all these opinions. And of course, I was an outsider and didn't count for anything from as far as the student movement, but it was kind of hair raising all during that time. And while you were here, wasn't that the Cambodian incursion? And the campus basically shut down during that time period. My office was always being used by students to call Stevenson College and so on. So that's what I remember about your time here the most. It was kind of one amazing thing after the other brought to us by the rest of the world. But the students by then here were very willing to join into that. They were all liberal arts, people I called searchers and seekers. They didn't want to go to the traditional places. They didn't want to go to be in their mother's sorority or their dad's fraternity or something at standard schools or UCLA or Berkeley. And so basically open people and at a formative age. So that's what I remember about your time here.
Well,
I don't know whether you guys remember it all or not.
Well, I remember in some of our planning for this, I mentioned two nights that I remember quite profoundly. The night that Lyndon Johnson announced that he wasn't going to run for re-election in 1968. I remember strains of Handel's Messiah coming out of the window of dorms. And I remember the night when the first draft lottery was held, a night of great relief or great woe for the boys, the men in the college. I was lucky because my number was high, but that night changed lives. And the third night that people mentioned that I don't remember because I'd already gone to bed and didn't find out about it till the next morning was the assassination of Bobby Kennedy during the presidential primaries in 1968.
Yeah. So your first year was a year that it was outside. So many outside forces were impacting on us. And in a way, it was kind of good that we had some routines, for these things. Was that the year? I don't know. Anyway, we tried to have these culture breaks, as you know, and this is maybe when Frank and I were on the same square, and so I tried to run one they called the Fantasy Festival. And I don't know whether that was 67 or 68. Because some faculty said, well, these things are too frivolous. And so I thought, wow, dreams, people are talking about drugs. I brought in all of these really, fine faculty members that were experts on fairy tales and dreams and every kind of thing. And trying to bridge that gap. And so we did we had a beach party down on the west side playing fields. So we had those kind of things pretty well established within the college systems itself, and so we were rolling along. The other thing I wanted to say was that by the time you got here, some of the people that were most upset on the faculty by what was going on had left. So the first year we had a big lot of meetings that were exciting. And where I really caught this spirit that Frank was talking about, Paige Smith proposed we do away with grades. We had these many discussions, and it came down to a vote that was very interesting to me because we made several compromises for med students, for this, for that. Anyway, we came down to a vote, and everybody voted for the plan for no grades as amended, except two, and one was a very conventional person. I won't mention names, of course, but he voted no because he said this would destroy education. And so he left that year. So that kind of person would leave. Incidentally, the other person that you all know that voted no, he wouldn't vote for the plan, was Jasper Rose, because these little compromises, he said, would undermine the no grade system, and we should just have evaluations. And so these two extremes voted against the plan. I learned a lot from that. And became that perfect is the enemy of the good was a statement I learned at that time. Maybe Page Smith said it. He was good at that. But I learned about, the people that are purists, that are perfect, they don't like the good. And so, let's apply it. Radicals don't like liberals. And so, you got that kind of tension all the time in dealing within the faculty or within the student body. Yeah, I've had my say on that. Have you got another question? And
Well, and I mean, we talked
questions
about,
out there.
we talked about our first year. You mentioned as we were getting ready for this, that you spent our senior year, 70 and 71, visiting UC Santa Barbara. Can you, since we're in an academic setting, can you do a little compare and contrast?
Yeah, I wanted to I'd gotten to know a lot of sociologists down there, and I was mostly in psych here, but I could teach courses on Who Rules America and Cowell and other things. So I thought, well, we'll try it. And I went down to Santa Barbara, and I was in this building with, on one floor was sociologists, one floor was like maybe some other social science, but often a separate building. It was a weird looking building, was psychology. I never met a single psychologist. We'd march down to lunch, kind of, 3 or 4 people. You'd see people along the way on this big avenue that was, so it was, you could see lots of people, and that was kind of an interesting thing. But in the end, it just felt so, you were in cubicles. Today we talk about silos, but I experienced then being in a big silo of sociology. So there was no question that we were going to come back here, and my family and I. I mean, by then we were totally into it, right? I mean, even I had a little longer hair, and I was a pretty straight guy out of the 50s. And just like the atmosphere here, it was just a little, Santa Barbara is beautiful, but I shouldn't be bad mouthing it, but it's also a little perfect, and this was much more relaxed, scruffy place. And there's, and it's just as beautiful, if not more so. So there's no question, but it really made me appreciate, I think, the relative loosey-goosiness of Santa Cruz. And same way with working with students. And I'd have students in those days. What I remember so much is that because of the way the campus worked, and McHenry was very much for anybody that was getting financial support would work on something serious. So the students didn't work on the loading docks or just sitting in the library or all this that they later had to do once the budgets were squeezed. And they'd walk in and say, "Do you need any researchers?" And yeah. So I had 5 or 6 or 7 people always working with me. And I would say, "Hi, if you're out there, Sharon Hauser Moss. I saw you signed up, and there you were, one of the great researchers that I worked with, and others on all these things." And so our students were fantastic, and they were open. And so I never really needed graduate students. We never had them in psychology till the early 70s. We didn't have them in sociology in the late 70s. But I always found plenty fun, because faculty do need challenging students. And it is important to teach and be asked questions. It's important to have to prepare for a class and say, how am I going to explain that? And then you're done with the lecture and you say, I think I haven't said it that well before. I better go write that down. So it really is interactive. Having stimulating students really matters in writing. And then having a student that'll say, "I'd like to do an independent study on that," or as many of you do, "I don't believe it. Can I check that more?" And yeah, have an independent study. And so that becomes then interactive and more mutual. And the attitudes of our students were such that they were more willing to do that. students became once more, again, like in the 50s, like I was from, they became more dutiful. You know, they do what you tell them. And well, I kind of like you to do most of what, you know, I tell you in class. But you know, the pushback is useful. And we got plenty of it from you.
Well, but it's interesting because in our little Zoom get together last night with a chancellor, somebody asked her sort of what her experiences have been on the campus since she came up from Riverside. And she commented one of the things she focused on was the students. She said usually when she, you know, in her past visiting places or at Riverside, she talked to students and everything was okay. She said, but here the challenges they'll challenge you, and it's not just one. You know, she said there are always vocal students, but she said everybody here is willing to raise those kinds of issues. So it's really interesting to hear that tradition that we're proud of starting continues today. Also, I mean, my experience on the campus it interacted with the academic side, but after I retired, I was flattered to be asked by then Dean of the Arts to serve on a search committee for a new faculty member, a new faculty position in the history of architecture. And so for the one and only time, I went through the academic recruitment process. I knew a little bit about it because Julia, my wife, worked in academic personnel, so I knew
She and I are great buddies.
But it was so great. It was so great because over and over again, the faculty in what is now the history of art and visual culture talked about the teaching potential of each of the candidates. So teaching clearly, at least in that department, is a valued asset of future faculty colleagues.
Yeah, definitely. And I think given the image the campus developed, it selected for that. In other words, people that didn't want to do that and didn't want to mix it up with students didn't come here, didn't apply, or soon left. And we had one very famous professor come here, and he had an office down the hall from me in Cowell. And he, as I say, was very proper and so on. He left within 3 or 4 years. His student stayed because his student, who was no spring chicken by that point, he stayed. He loved it. But this guy left. He just wasn't used to, you know, having people knock on the door, challenge him. The danger is that people can become deferential. You're professor this or professor that, and they've heard this, and so they come too deferential, so to speak. So these kind of people then wouldn't come here. We had very famous psychologists come here that also really liked teaching, and that was part of why they came here, because it wasn't quite as regarded at some of the places that they had been, which were quite distinguished places. So I think that was part of it. There was, no concern that there was going to be restrictions on what you said. It did allow you to really develop your own ideas, to put your own emphases in courses. So I think our courses in that sense were less cookie cutter and more express the person, still within the discipline. I mean, I used always mainstream textbooks, but I would, throw in a couple others. And that was the other thing. We were using multiple books. And so it was a very interactive time. And I do know from continuing to teach into the 2000s, in fact, 2018 or so, when I just lost my mojo. I'm feeling it obviously today, but I got so nervous going into a classroom and facing students and so on. But we didn't have in those, and the students don't say much. So it's not like they say, how come you're not doing this today? Or it'll get you going. And so it was different when we were a very small school. The other thing I would like to add to everybody is, that when we started out, they gave us a real break on faculty student ratio. That is, we had the ratio of Amherst, or one of those Ivy schools. There were 12 of you for every one of us. Pretty quickly, they jacked that up to 18 or 19. But in fact, it's probably higher than that. And in some disciplines, it's higher than that. So just lots and lots of students major in biology, computer science, and psychology. And so those disciplines, the faculty in those disciplines have a lot more students. And so in reaction, the faculty interacts differently. So some of you may have had different experiences if you were in psych versus whether you were in anthro or soc or philosophy, which was smaller, or lit got to be smaller, and it changed. And then economics had smaller interest when you guys were here. They had a very small faculty. Today, they're much larger. So, we do, in that sense, the university is more flexible than we all think. You just have to see it in a little bit longer perspective in your quick 4 years or my quick 4 years as a undergraduate when I knew no faculty, didn't have a clue, did what I was supposed to do. And that is, we did accommodate to what student interests were. There were more going into this field, more go into that, more call for this, more interest in certain things. You start hiring people in that field within psych, or you start hiring more economists or more whatevers. So the campus does get shaped a lot by the kind of students that it had. So when we were small and we had that low faculty student ratio, then it was able to be this pretty wild and woolly place intellectually. And then to throw in the rest of the world with all the things that were happening in wars and environment and civil rights, feminist movement, and so on. And you got a lot of ferment during the time that you all were students. That it's just not there, I don't think, as much today. It's more routinized. Certainly, there are still activist students, but the percentages are smaller, and that's one of the things that happened, after you guys left. And my one of my former great grad students, Richard Gendron, and I wrote a book. He had a great idea of studying the city after the earthquake because he knew there'd be all these arguments over land and so on. And between the downtown business community and the progressives that ran the place. One of the key parts of the progressives winning was students voted. You were very strong activists. You were living off campus, a lot of you, not all of you, but by junior, senior years, there still wasn't a real housing crunch. And so you often lived in these neighborhoods. And so you were part of the neighborhood groups pretty easily. But now the students, it's harder to get them to vote. They got the students out to vote the last couple of times, but it went down. So the place changed, and I think it was a different place by the 1990s, late 1990s, and then all the people had been here in the 60s and 70s. We pretty much retired in 90, 92, and 94 because the university was having a budget crisis, but they had a big pension plan. And so they offloaded us onto the pension plan, but promised we could teach some more. There was for 5 more years I could teach. Well, it was an offer that nobody could refuse in this whole world. And so all the people that had that kind of spirit that we're talking about, that you had, or that I imbibed, I was open to it certainly, but I didn't, I wanted out of the smog. I wanted out of the freeways. I wanted out of LA. So, and I was happy, and it was a loosey-goosey place. So all of that, all those folks are gone, and the university, I think, became a little more mainstream. But I got to be careful because I'm not there day by day. I don't have a feel of it. I don't have that feel that I have a sense of knowing the place the way I once did.
Well, we're about out of time, but I want to thank you, Frank, and thank you, Bill, for that fascinating presentation. Our next program is going to be at 12 o'clock. It'll be Cowell. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Bye now.
Thanks, George.
Take it easy.